Hey guys, Jay here. Welcome to Eons of Battle and welcome back to Other Games April. And in the spirit of the month, I want to talk about two very similar war games. One you've probably heard of, Kill Team, and one you might not have, Dead Zone. These are both sci-fi skirmish war games that are very, very similar, and I think that'll make it interesting to compare and contrast the two and then crown one the winner. I juggle a lot of war games, and they all have different stats and different maths. But my goal is to be the very best, like no one ever was. And I'm one step closer to achieving my goal with today's sponsor, Brilliant.org. Brilliant is the online learning platform that teaches you complex concepts in an engaging manner through easy-to-follow, bite-sized, interactive learning experiences. And in my experience, to beat Sean is my real test. To make more mathematically sound decisions is my goal. And to achieve that goal, I found the Introduction to Probability course very enlightening. Following these lessons, I can learn to make better decisions in my tabletop wargaming, which is good, because I was considering flashcards, but this is better. With bite-sized lessons that break down important concepts into understandable parts, you can gradually master whole topics in as little as 15 minutes a day. Brilliant boosts your analytical thinking skills to make you a better problem solver in every part of your life, whether that's 40K, Kill Team, Malifaux, Dead Zone, Fallout Wasteland Warfare, or like your career, if that's what you're into. Brilliant's interactive learning has been proven to be 6 times more effective than passive learning. If you want to try out everything Brilliant has to offer for free for a full 30 days, you can go to brilliant.org/eonsofbattle or follow the link in the description below. The first 200 of you guys will get 20% off Brilliant's premium annual subscription. Thanks Brilliant.org for teaching me that if I roll 6 sixes, I have a 0.6651% chance of rolling a natural 6. Kill Team has a 144-page rulebook, though in typical Games Workshop fashion, you only need about 30 pages out of the book. The rules are pretty darn simple. The only thing that is really complicated, actually there's 2 things that are really complicated, but the first thing you'll notice when reading the rule book is that the cover and terrain rules are dense. Your models can go anywhere because it's a standard tape measure measuring system, but man, the interaction with terrain is definitely the trickiest thing I find when explaining this game to new people. There's 2 different mechanics for actually measuring between 2 models in the game. There's line of sight, which is just line of sight between any points on the models, which does lead to some feel bad moments of I can see the tip of your gun barrel because that barrel you're hiding behind isn't quite big enough, and so I can actually shoot at you. And then there's the cover mechanic where you draw cones, or actually you draw triangles from any part of your model's base to the entirety of your opponent's base. And so you kind of have to balance those 2 together, and as you're moving a model across the board, you're just kind of seeing the matrix flow around you as you're trying to figure out exactly where all of these lines are being measured from. Dead Zone has an 88-page rulebook, and you need to read about 40 of the pages. There are more pages of rules, although I would say a lot of the mechanics are a little bit simpler. The way that they deal with everything actually is a grid system, which at first I wasn't super stoked on because I thought it meant that the terrain and like the setup and movement would be very grid-based, like chess, where you just move things across the grid. But actually it works out really well. I didn't realize how long measuring and thinking about measuring takes, but just I can move 1 space, I can move 2 spaces. It just becomes so simple, and the movement and the speed of the game actually increases a lot with this grid-based system. And it means things like climbing, jumping over things, and moving up and down terrain becomes a lot simpler. I don't know if one is better than the other, but man, are they really different. And Dead Zone also sort of has an answer to some of those feel bad moments of a tiny little elbow of your model is visible so I can shoot at you, where you actually take your base and you kind of draw up a cylinder in your mind, and anything of your model within that cylinder is considered your model, and anything outside of that cylinder is not your model. So if you do have a little bit of gun or a little bit of elbow or a little bit of butt sticking out somewhere, it's not actually visible to your opponent. It is a little bit annoying that there is still sort of a 2-step process where you've got the grid and you've got measuring true line of sight, but I do think it is a slightly simpler mechanic that is definitely easier to explain to my friends than Kill Team system. I would say that really that is my big flaw of Kill Team. Although, the only complaint I hear about Kill Team 2 is the list building, or basically the lack thereof. There really isn't any list building in Kill Team 2. There is, because I think Games Workshop thinks that list building is like their claim to fame, and so they need to pretend that their game has list building, but it doesn't. It really doesn't. Whenever you get a team for Kill Team 2, really what you should do is just go on Reddit and say, what is the thing to build? Because it is very important to build the most optimal list you possibly can, and there's very few options. Usually you'll have about 10 operatives, and each operative will have special, unique things that they can do and nobody else can, and they'll synergize well with the rest of your crew. I've heard a lot of people describe playing Kill Team 2 as you are piloting a certain faction, and that is very, very accurate. Kill Team 2 is a very balanced strategic game, and it is super important to not give yourself any handicaps like taking the incorrect models. So really, even though there is some list building and you are allowed to take certain models and leave certain models out, it is incredibly important to take the right ones. And so if I'm playing Orc Commandos or if I'm playing Veteran Guardsmen, I almost know exactly what my opponent will be taking every single time. In my opinion, it'd be fine if there was no list building whatsoever, because there's like 37 different factions in Kill Team, so that's plenty of variety right there. And I would be perfectly happy if it just, these are your models, this is what you're taking, just like Warhammer Underpants. Now, Dead Zone, on the other hand, is a very different game in this regard. It has classic points-based army list building, where you can take a hero, any number of troops, elites, heavy supports, and then you can take some auxiliaries. And you kind of follow this tree chart of what you're allowed to take, and you can bring basically anything from Mantic's catalog. 10 people can play the Vermine, which is the little rat dudes. 10 people can play this one faction, and all of them can have a completely different force for this battle, because you just pay points to take anything you want, and then you pay more points to take upgrades on those units. And the upgrades is another thing that really sets Dead Zone apart, and I really, really like it. In Kill Team, game setup is always completely perfectly symmetrical, with your deployment zones on opposite sides from one another, and your objectives perfectly placed in the middle so that everybody has equal access to them in the game. It's very, very balanced because Kill Team is such a balanced, competitively focused game. And it does lead to a lot of fun and a lot of like really tense, like, it is my goal, it is my job, it is every part of my being to try to win. I am piloting my faction and I am going to win this mission. Where in Dead Zone, it's very similar. There's still objectives and there's still opposite, your deployment zones are opposite from each other, but there's another thing which is objects and items. And you take a big pile of these items, they're little tokens. One side will have a picture on them and one side will just have like a token on them. And you deposit these all over the battlefield. And these are random perks that you can pick up, just like in a video game, just like when Mario gets that star. You move your guys across the board through your grid system. And then if you end up in a cube that has one of these tokens in it, you can decide to flip it and take a look at it. And maybe it's extra bullets, or maybe it's a combat knife, or maybe it's a med pack, or maybe it's a grenade, and which Nick got a couple of times and he blew me up. But it adds a crazy amount of silliness and weirdness and randomness that can happen, and it's wonderful. You could be a guy on 1 health left, but you picked up a grenade, and all of a sudden you are an incredibly deadly threat, and you could not have planned for that before the game started. Where Kill Team is all about planning. I have played tons and tons of the different factions in Kill Team, and without fail, the first game is an absolute train wreck because I am not familiar with every single one of my units and exactly what they do. So basically I'm playing the team naked without their special abilities. And basically every team is completely garbage without their special abilities, without a full understanding of everything that they do. And so yeah, it always ends in complete failure. Dead Zone has a lot more weirdness and wackiness to it. And so even if I'm not 100% sure exactly what my guys do, it doesn't really matter because the guys are actually pretty blank for the most part. And what comes into play is the universal special rules. If anybody ever played Warhammer 40k pre-8th edition, you'll know all about universal special rules. It is basically a glossary in the back of the book that has all of the different abilities that any model in the game can do. Your miniature will just say that they have rending, and then you look in the glossary to see what rending actually does. And it helps because once you start to learn all of these keywords, you'll know if your opponent says, oh, this shot has rending, you instantly know what it does. Where if it's more of a kill team situation, they might have rending claws. Well, what does rending claws do? They do the exact same thing, but they're called rending claws and your guys are called Furious Strike. Another big difference in these two games is how they each handle actions. Now, Kill Team is based on the classic D6, and basically every single thing in the game has ways of modifying these D6s. That's probably the most important thing. A lot of it comes down to special rules or stratagems. Oh, and by the way, Kill Team has universal special rules too. They're just not called universal special rules and there's fewer of them, but in the back of the book, there is a glossary of special actions that usually are equipped onto your weapons and sometimes onto the miniatures themselves, but they're not called universal special rules, and the way that special rules take place is spread out more through the core book, the weapon system, and your actual miniatures profile. And so it's harder to explain. It all works really, really well, but it's a little bit harder to explain, where if I'm explaining Dead Zone to a new person and they have something on their card that says, oh, I can take a Sky Drop. Then you just look it up in the glossary and there it'll be Sky Drop. You can deploy your guys anywhere on the board instead of in your deployment zone. Kill Team is based on the classical D6, but Dead Zone is based on a D8. And I've always wanted to try Kill Team with a D8 system because I feel like having those 2 extra numbers on your die adds a ton more granularity, and you can delete so many units, so many rules that are just about shooting a little bit better or shooting a little bit worse because you actually have those extra numbers. So there's just a little bit more room on the dial of balancing these 2 things, and I really, really like it. Also, what Dead Zone handles really well, in my opinion, is how they handle modifying these D8s, because you don't actually ever modify your dice results. What you can do is add or subtract dice from the pool. And so all actions start out with a dice roll of 3 D8s, but you can add more based on your positioning in the game. If you have a completely clear line of sight to your opponent, you can add 2 dice to your pool, and now you're rolling 5 and you're almost certain to do better. But if you're shooting into a block that has one of your friendly guys in it, then you actually subtract 2 dice. And so really all you're worrying about is adding or subtracting dice to the pool, which is how tons and tons of war games handle it. And I think it's a really good system because it's just more exciting all of a sudden to have a big old pool of dice. You could have 1, 2, 3. You could have up to 6 dice. You could probably get more. I just don't know if I found those edge cases. But it's so exciting to have a big handful of dice and you're almost certain to get off whatever you're trying to do. Where with Kill Team, even with modifiers and rerolls, it's always sometimes a nail biter to try to get that 3 dice roll. And I'm like, I need 6s, come on, I should get 6s. Statistically, I'll get a 6 and I'll get my special thing off. But it's it's worrying. And that's also fun too, that little that fear that this dice roll is not gonna go exactly how you want it to be. But I think it's just a good system to add more dice to the pool. And then you have just a louder, heavier clunk as you drop those dice onto the table. It's a really, really nice system. Both these games also have a pre-turn strategy phase. Kill Team strategy phase is pretty fun, although at least once per game, and the game only lasts 4 turns in Kill Team, but once per game, we will forget the strategy phase and move straight into the fighting phase because that's the game. Moving your models and fighting with your models is the game, and so it's not uncommon to forget the strategy phase, but basically you pay points that you have a pool of pre-game to get these power-up buffs that your whole army gets before the start of the game. And these are really, really good, and you have to be aware of them beforehand so that you know exactly when to pop them off, and so that you can give your army the buff so that you plan ahead as what am I going to be trying to achieve this turn, and then you play your stratagems accordingly. We forget it at least once a game, but it is a very important part of the game, and it's good to have these kind of beginning of the turn things to kind of force players into thinking critically about stuff like that. Although Dead Zone sort of doesn't really require that because they handle it very similar to how Warcry handles it, where you actually take these special dice, they're D6s, but they have different things on the faces, and these are power-ups that you can hand out to your team, and you roll them. You actually have the ability to re-roll them so that you can try to force certain things to happen. If your army is more close combat, you can try to re-roll and get some of those close combat focus things. If your team is more shooty, you can re-roll to try to get those shooty options. But you just roll these dice, and then that's what you've got, and then you have a little pool of extra things you can do. Maybe you have a movement, a shoot, and a free fight. And so during the game, you and your opponent can kind of see what the other one has, and like, uh-oh, they rolled a lot of extra shooting this turn. Maybe it'd be worth it to do a little bit more hiding this turn. Or they got tons and tons of close combat, I'm just gonna go hard early game with my activations to try to blow their big shooters off the board before they can spend some of those dice. It's a nice, simple mechanic, and I think because it's random, it might be a little bit easier to remember because you are just hoping for, you don't get to choose what you get, but you're hoping for what you get, as opposed to Kill Team where you just pick what you get. So both of these are a really interesting strategy phase. It adds a really interesting element to the game, and it does a nice job of kind of separating the turns a little bit, because if that didn't exist, then the fighting phase where you're just activating models would just slide together into one big thing. It's really interesting mechanic. Like, I always kind of think about, like, if I was making a game, Like how do you discover these necessities that aren't readily apparent or are not like obvious? I feel like the only way I could come up with a game is to just rip off another game. I might have it completely changed by the end of it, but game design is really, really interesting. In terms of actually getting people into these games, I think they're probably about even. They both have a similar amount of rules. The only thing it comes down to, I think, is if people prefer a little bit more of a narrative, bring what you want, versus a piloting of certain teams. Kill Team has almost 40 teams, so there's plenty of variety to choose from. And it's a little bit more readily apparent what these teams are because you really only take one exact thing. And so if somebody wants to play Orc Commandos, they can know exactly what it's going to be. It's going to be every single model in that box, especially after the new errata. Where with Dead Zone, they do have a faction book. And inside of this faction book, it contains every single rule for every single miniature that you can take, including some pictures of every single one of the miniatures. And so it's more exciting, I think, to choose exactly what you want to take and be like, well, I want one giant stompy robot and almost nothing else. That's a really, really interesting list. Or I want nothing but fodder troops and I want to absolutely flood the board. And so which one of those is going to appeal to people more? Which one of them gives you more creativity in your painting and modeling? I think they're both about even, and it just comes down to personal preference, which one you like more. I know the list building is really the only, the big chief complaint for Kill Team, but it is a little bit confusing where, you've just played a demo game with somebody and they're really excited and they're like, all right, pick from one of 800 miniatures. Pick a small selection of those and that's your force, as opposed to with Kill Team, you go on the website and basically whatever box says Kill Team on it, that is your entire Kill Team, with a few exceptions like Harlequins and some other things where they're sort of like, you can sort of play with just what comes in the box, but you're gonna want like one or two things from other places. Things like that. I mean, there's things like that in every Games Workshop game and it's always a little frustrating, but I think both these games are pretty darn similar in how you actually get into it. And it just comes down to that personal preference of, do I want to pick everything or do I want to pick from a humongous list of really interesting things? Now, the one thing in these games that is completely different is probably my one complaint with Kill Team, which is when you're setting up a miniature, you choose for them to be in Engaged or Concealed. And this represents a model ready for action or kind of hiding in the shadows. And it changes how you interact with terrain. And if you're in the Conceal order, then it changes what actions you're allowed to take. You're not allowed to shoot, and you're not allowed to do some certain other actions. And this is a really, really tricky mechanic to wrap your head around and to understand. It's simple what it does, but the way it fundamentally changes what actions you can do and what your models are gonna get up to this turn is really, really tricky. I find myself struggling with when to have models in Conceal and when to have models with Engage. I'm not that good at planning ahead and problem solving. Hopefully Brilliant.org will fix that. But it's really, really frustrating when I have a model on Conceal and then all of a sudden, halfway through the turn, the game has changed dramatically and I really wish they weren't on Conceal. But I've already made that decision and so I don't have options to certain things like Overwatch. You make this decision at the beginning of each of your model's activations and it's sometimes you never really want to be in Conceal because you have like a low model count army and so you're always going to be on Engaged. Some factions kind of force you to always be in Conceal, but they have ways around this Conceal. And the way it changes how you interact with terrain, where if you're in Concealing Terrain, you can all of a sudden no longer be shot at, even if you are visible to your opponent, because you have cover and you're concealed. And so you're essentially hunkering down and making sure that you can't be shot at. But sometimes you can be shot at if you're on a vantage point. It's a really, really tricky thing in the game. And I feel like it's also very, very confusing to new people who finally, they're getting through their head exactly what they're allowed to do with their miniatures, but all of a sudden you have this fundamental choice of hidden or open and what that means for the future of the game, because you're making this decision for the future because you decide when you're setting up your miniatures, you kind of have to make that decision for exactly what everybody is going to do turn one before anything is actually started to happen. So I think Conceal and Engage is the trickiest thing in Kill Team 2 for me, where Dead Zone is much more just your guys are your guys. They can take up to 2 actions per turn, and there's nothing really is going to change about that. And so that just makes it just removes all of that clutter from the game and you kind of don't have to worry about anything. There's still all the things like cover and just physically being hidden behind stuff that you can do, but all of that just comes down to movement and terrain, and there's nothing you can do to modify that. And so I just find it so much simpler if your models are just your models and they just do what they're gonna do. It's interesting. I've played so much Kill Team 2, and I have made so many miniatures concealed and engaged, and I would love if there was a specific thing to it, but it completely depends on what your team is, what your models do, what you're planning on doing, the objectives of the game. It's very situational, and I think that's what makes it such a tricky decision of conceal versus engage versus dead zones. Just, it's not in the game. You just do what you're gonna do with your miniatures. You can do a sprint action, you can do a march action, shooting, fighting, and where in Kill Team 2, you can only do each action once, barring a few outlying situations. In Dead Zone, you can only do every action once. However, if you remember those command dice from the beginning of the turn that you rolled, you can just hand those right out like candy. Oh, I'm gonna do a sprint action, so now I'm all out of actions. Well, I'm just gonna grab that march dice and I'm gonna march them one more cube. And you can do that to any operative on the board during their activation. It's great. So you just, sometimes, you leave, it's a little dangerous to leave it towards the end because you might get out activated, or you might end up dying and not having those actions to spend on those little power-ups. But sometimes it's, your opponent knows, like, that's a lot of close combat. That's a lot of free close combat dice they have in their dice pool. Both these games are very, very similar and very, very fun. But you know what is almost more fun? That's right, our Patreon. Over there, we have new STL Terrain packs available every month. This month, we have the Twisted Train Station, a lovely little platform full of spikes and horror. We also make one extra episode of Eons of Battle every single week where we take a look at our viewers' miniatures and give some ideas and critiques of how to improve their painting. We host live Discord hangouts, and we have a tier where you can get your name on one of my Black Templar Space Marines and you can join the Immortal Crusade. Both these games are very, very similar, but I think they do one thing really differently, and that's how they feel. Kill Team is a really, really dense, balanced, tight skirmish game where if you and your opponent both really know what you're doing, it is going to be an absolute fight, and it feels so good to win because it proves that you have the better skills and mettle. Dead Zone is much more fun, where you bring whatever you want and there's tons of randomness that can happen that can lead to really, really fun and moments that are memorable when you're actually sitting down to play the game. So is one better than the other? It would definitely come down to personal preference, but I really like them both, and I think they both have place on a shelf in my basement. Thanks for watching.